Welcome to History to Relax, where you can slow down, take a deep breath, and drift into the past one quiet story at a time. Tonight, we're stepping back into a world of shadowed corridors, candlelit wards, and whispered prayers. A time when getting sick was not just frightening, it was dangerous. In this immersive journey through the world of Victorian medicine, we'll explore what it meant to fall ill in an age of bleeding, blistering, and belief. We'll walk the halls of overcrowded hospitals, peek inside a surgeon's blood-stained apron, and witness how pain, persistence, and trial slowly gave way to the earliest forms of modern healing. So find a comfortable place to rest. Let your eyes grow heavy, and allow this story to unfold slowly, one breath at a time. If you enjoy this calm journey through history, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more peaceful storytelling, and leaving a comment to let us know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Thank you for joining us. Now, let's begin. Part 1. Whispers of Disease. In the heart of Victorian London, the air was thick with smoke and sorrow. Narrow streets pressed tightly together, choked with horse dung, chimney soot, and the unrelenting stink of refuse. The city pulsed with life, yet death hovered nearby, not dramatic or sudden, but quiet, creeping, and constant. Illness was not a rare misfortune. It was a companion, a shadow, an inevitability. Each morning, as markets stirred and factories hissed into motion, citizens stepped cautiously into a world where invisible threats waited. A scratch could fester. A cough might never end. A mother could cradle her child in the morning and bury them before dusk. And yet, life carried on, despite the danger, or perhaps because of it. There were no guarantees in this era, only odds. Poor families living 10 to a room might see half their children die before reaching adolescence. The upper classes, though protected by space and servants, were not immune. Disease did not always care for status. It rode on breath, water, and touch. And its names were many. Scarlet fever, typhoid, tuberculosis, smallpox, cholera. These illnesses were not abstract. They were intimate. Each had a scent, a sound, a story whispered from behind drawn curtains. Fevered murmurs echoed through thin walls. Blood-spotted handkerchiefs lay folded on nightstands. A neighbor's drawn blinds might stay shut for weeks. The silence that followed was usually permanent. One of the most feared afflictions was cholera, the Blue Death, as it came to be known. Within hours of infection, a healthy man could become a shriveled husk. Vomiting, diarrhea, muscle cramps that bent the body in unnatural ways. Worst of all, the skin would turn ashen, even bluish, as fluids drained away. People collapsed in the streets, sometimes too weak to call for help. Others were found in outhouses or alleys, alone and contorted. At the time, no one knew why it spread. The prevailing theory blamed miasma, bad air, foul smells. Doctors believed that disease drifted invisibly through the atmosphere, carried by odors from waste, corpses, and decay. It made a certain kind of sense. After all, where the stench was strongest, death usually followed. Few people questioned this idea. Even the most learned physicians endorsed it. But the truth was far more unsettling. Cholera thrived in water, not air. It crept into homes through the very pumps and pipes meant to nourish and sustain. People drank their own poison, every sip drawing death closer. In London, the Broad Street outbreak of 1854 became infamous. Dozens fell ill within days, most from a single neighborhood. Noxious air was blamed. Streets were scrubbed, windows closed, incense burned. None of it worked. The dying continued. It wasn't until Dr. John Snow, a skeptical physician, began mapping cases that a pattern emerged. They clustered around a single water pump. Snow, unlike most of his colleagues, suspected water might be to blame. He removed the handle from the Broad Street pump. The number of new cases dropped. It was a revelation, not a cure, but a clue. Yet the idea took decades to catch on. Too many resisted. It was easier to believe in bad air than rethink the entire understanding of disease. And while cities debated, people kept dying. Typhoid fever was another constant threat. It didn't blaze through communities like cholera. Instead, it simmered. It wore down its victims with headaches, rash, high fevers, and stomach pain. In its worst stages, delirium set in. The sick babbled nonsense, tore at their bedclothes, or lay in a stupor for days. Often, they didn't recover. The disease favored crowded areas, especially where sanitation was poor, and in Victorian cities that described nearly every corner. What passed for a sore in most districts was simply a trench or pipe that emptied into the nearest river. Human waste mixed with runoff from slaughterhouses and tanneries, then flowed freely into the Thames or the nearest stream. Some children played near these canals. Others drew drinking water from them. And still, officials hesitated to invest in proper sanitation. It cost money. It required change. So people lived alongside their own waste and wondered why they couldn't stop coughing. Children were particularly vulnerable. In poor districts, infant mortality rates soared. It wasn't unusual for a family to bury 3 or 4 children before one reached the age of 10. Some diseases came in waves. Others never left. Measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, each carved through classrooms and neighborhoods with terrifying regularity. When a child began to sweat and shiver, mothers watched with helpless dread. There were no reliable antibiotics. No fever reducers beyond cool cloths or herbal teas. Medicine bottles might offer laudanum or opium, enough to quiet a child, not cure them. And while some children recovered, others did not. Death was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, slow, and almost polite. A child too tired to cry. Eyes that drifted closed and didn't open again. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was often called, was a different kind of killer. Romanticized in novels and art, it was anything but elegant in truth. It devoured from within. Victims coughed up blood, grew gaunt, and wasted away over months or even years. The disease was everywhere, in drawing rooms, boarding houses, and even in royal courts. Unlike cholera, tuberculosis did not burst into communities. It lingered. A family might live with it for years before recognizing the signs. The father's persistent cough. The mother's pale cheeks. The daughter's fainting spells. It moved slowly, destroying bodies and families one breath at a time. Some blamed heredity. Others suspected spirits. A few, like Florence Nightingale, began to consider environment, cleanliness, light, and fresh air. But even the most forward-thinking ideas had little immediate impact. Until germ theory gained ground, medicine had no real tools to stop the spread. And so the dying continued. Doctors, for all their authority, were often powerless. They visited homes with leather bags and stern expressions, but their treatments rarely cured. Some offered bloodletting, believing illness was caused by excess humors. Others prescribed emetics to induce vomiting. Most dispensed opiates to mask symptoms. Only a handful dared to question these methods. Many simply accepted failure as part of the job. It didn't help that medical education was uneven at best. Some physicians had years of formal training. Others apprenticed under older doctors, learning by observation and trial. Quackery flourished. Anyone with a coat, confidence, and a few bottles of colored tonic could call themselves a healer. And desperate families paid what they could, hoping for miracles. Chemists, the Victorian version of pharmacists, were no better. Their shops brimmed with powders, tinctures, and syrups. Many of these remedies contained deadly ingredients: mercury, arsenic, strychnine. The line between medicine and poison was thin, and most customers didn't know the difference. It was not uncommon for an ailing man to take a spoonful of syrup laced with opium and sleep for 12 hours, only to wake feeling worse. Some never woke at all. There were no warning labels, no regulations. Children could walk in and purchase laudanum without question. It soothed pain, quieted nerves, and slowly addicted a generation. In the wealthier parts of town, the danger looked different but felt just as real. Private doctors made house calls. Drawing rooms were converted into sick rooms. Beds were piled with woolen blankets and surrounded by vases of lavender to ward off miasma. But comfort didn't equal safety. Disease ignored decor. Even royalty could not escape it. Queen Victoria herself lost Prince Albert to typhoid fever in 1861. Despite access to the best care of the time, he died at 42. His death shocked the nation and reminded all that illness cared little for titles. And still, the world outside kept spinning. Horses clattered along cobblestones. Gas lamps flickered to life each evening. Children played in alleyways, unaware they were dancing through invisible clouds of contagion. Families gathered in chapels, offering prayers not just for the dead, but for the living, hoping to be spared another visit from the doctor, the undertaker, or the black cart that rolled through streets at dawn. There were glimpses of progress. A few pioneering minds began to challenge long-held assumptions. Joseph Lister, inspired by Pasteur's work on microbes, introduced antiseptics into surgery. Florence Nightingale transformed nursing and sanitation in military hospitals, later applying those lessons to civilian life. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to shift. But for much of the Victorian era, medicine was not a shield. It was a gamble, a roll of the dice between hope and harm. To fall ill was to step into uncertainty. To survive was a quiet miracle. And in homes across Britain, candles continued to flicker beside beds. Mothers pressed hands to warm foreheads. Children stared at ceilings, listening to the sounds of the street, wondering if they would ever walk outside again. Part 2. A Doctor's Bag of Horrors. It was said that when a doctor knocked on the door in Victorian England, fear followed close behind. Not because the physician himself was threatening. Many arrived with soft voices, trimmed beards, and courteous nods. But what he carried, what rattled within that worn leather bag slung at his side, told a different story. Medicine, in that era, was still more guesswork than science. The doctor's tools did not promise healing. They promised intervention. And often, they made matters worse. The black bag itself, though modest in size, contained the weight of countless hopes and quiet dreads. Mothers watched nervously as it was unbuckled. Children peeked around corners, eyes wide with uncertainty. Inside that leather pouch lay metal, glass, powder, and cloth, each item capable of harm as well as help. There were no sterilized compartments, no compartments for safety, no guarantees of efficacy. Everything was placed in together, tools for teeth beside blades for surgery, bottles of laudanum nestled next to strips of bandage that had been used, rinsed, and reused more times than anyone could count. A visit from the doctor might mean bleeding. It might mean purging. Sometimes it meant a sharp blade drawn across the skin without warning or anesthetic. And always, it meant expense. Every action had a cost, in shillings, in blood, or in time stolen from a dwindling life. The first tool many patients encountered was the stethoscope. To modern eyes, it appears harmless enough. Yet in the Victorian age, it was a novelty, not a standard. Early models looked more like narrow wooden horns than the coiled rubber instruments familiar today. Many doctors still preferred to press an ear directly to the chest, feeling the warmth of the body beneath their cheek as they listened for irregular rhythms, for wheezing, for silence. This closeness, while intimate, offered little precision. Diagnosis remained speculative. Beside it, the thermometer began to appear, clumsy, long, and breakable. Early thermometers took minutes to measure a fever and often required insertion into the armpit or mouth for extended periods. A patient might sit in silence, lips clamped over glass, as the doctor counted heartbeats with fingers pressed against a pale wrist. But even if the fever was confirmed, what came next was seldom reassuring. Bloodletting, though slowly falling out of favor, still lingered in the medical culture of the time. Many doctors clung to the ancient belief in the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and saw imbalance as the root of all illness. To draw blood was to restore harmony. To restore harmony was to save a life. Or so it was thought. A small case of lancets, thin, sharp blades shaped like miniature knives, often rested in the doctor's bag. Some were hinged and folded like a gentleman's penknife. Others were fixed in bone or wooden handles, their edges dulled by repeated use. The lancet would be pressed against the arm, often near the elbow, then drawn across the skin in a swift motion. Blood was caught in a basin or cloth, and patients were encouraged to rest, to let the body realign itself. If they grew dizzy or collapsed, this was considered a sign that the treatment was working. Leeches offered an alternative. Stored in small jars or wrapped in damp linen, they were applied to the skin to draw blood gently, or rather, to allow nature to do the work the lancet had begun. The squirming creatures were believed to reduce inflammation, relieve headaches, even treat pregnancy complications. Their bites left small, circular wounds that bled for hours. Infection was common. Scars remained for life. Surgical instruments were perhaps the most disturbing contents of the bag. Bone saws, scalpels, forceps, each had its place. Each gleamed with the cold indifference of tools meant to cut, clamp, and remove. Many were reused without proper cleaning. A wipe with a cloth. A quick rinse in cool water. That was often the extent of sterilization before the next operation. Anesthesia, though introduced in the mid-19th century, was slow to gain acceptance. Many doctors doubted its necessity. Others feared it would kill more patients than the procedures themselves. Ether and chloroform were difficult to control, often administered by dousing a rag and pressing it over the mouth and nose. Dosage was a matter of intuition. Some patients slipped into a deep, merciful sleep. Others thrashed, vomited, or failed to wake. Surgery, when it occurred, was swift and brutal. Speed mattered more than precision. A leg could be amputated in under 3 minutes by a skilled surgeon. The goal was to complete the cut before the patient succumbed to shock or blood loss. Assistants held the screaming patient down. The doctor sawed through flesh, muscle, and bone while bystanders observed, sometimes in the hundreds. Surgical theaters were public spectacles in some hospitals, amphitheaters of pain and fascination. And yet, the danger did not end with the final stitch. Infection was an ever-present threat. Pus, swelling, and fever often followed. Surgeons rarely washed their hands, believing dirt and dried blood on their coats to be badges of honor. A blood-soaked apron signaled experience. Patients died not from the operation, but from what came after: sepsis, gangrene, or the slow wasting of the body's strength in the days that followed. In the absence of reliable cures, doctors often relied on pharmacology, though the term itself was far more generous than the substances it described. Medicines were mixtures of hope, superstition, and toxic compounds. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, was the most popular. It eased pain, soothed nerves, and induced sleep. It was given to adults and children alike. Its use was so widespread that addiction was rarely recognized, much less condemned. Women consumed it for menstrual cramps, grief, or hysteria. Men took it for backaches and melancholia. It was sold in elegant bottles with gold script and floral designs. Its danger was disguised in beauty. Chloral hydrate, another sedative, followed close behind. It brought calm but could also bring death. Mercury remained in use for syphilis. Arsenic was applied to skin conditions. Strychnine was prescribed in small doses to stimulate the heart. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, was given to women to dilate their pupils, for beauty as much as health. The doctor's bag, then, was a paradox. It offered tools of care, and instruments of pain, remedies and poisons, relief and risk. Each item told a story. The tourniquet, twisted tight before amputation. The glass syringe, used and reused despite cracks. The forceps, clamped on during complicated births. The obstetric hook, sometimes needed to remove a stillborn child from the womb. Few could speak of these things openly. Fewer still could forget them once seen. A visit from the doctor often began with reassurance. His tone was calm. His words were practiced. He might offer a spoonful of syrup, or a folded paper packet of powder. He would speak of balance, of restoring strength. But always, there was a reckoning, a moment when tools were laid out, sleeves rolled up, and the truth of the situation revealed itself. Many women, in particular, viewed such visits with dread. Female patients were seldom taken seriously. A woman complaining of pain might be diagnosed with hysteria, a catch-all term for anything doctors did not understand. Hysteria could mean headaches, exhaustion, anxiety, or disobedience. Treatments ranged from sedatives to forced isolation. In extreme cases, women were institutionalized. Others were subjected to pelvic massage, a euphemism for what modern minds recognize as abuse, performed in the name of medicine. Men were not spared. Laborious with broken limbs, infected wounds, or hernias found little comfort in the doctor's bag. Surgery meant work lost. An error could mean a lifetime of pain. Some opted to avoid the physician altogether, trusting instead to herbalists, bone setters, or faith. Midwives, too, offered care beyond the scope of male doctors. In working-class neighborhoods, these women provided childbirth assistance, comfort, and remedies passed down through generations. Though often dismissed by the medical establishment, they were trusted by their communities. Their knowledge of the body, of pain, and of recovery was born not from books but from experience. And in many cases, their outcomes were better than the physicians who looked down on them. For the very poor, the doctor's visit remained a rare luxury. They might rely on home remedies, mustard plasters, vinegar compresses, poultices of onion or garlic. Some turned to street vendors selling patent medicines from wooden carts. These brightly labeled bottles promised to cure all ills, from gout to consumption, and often did nothing. Or worse. The trust placed in doctors was fragile, often born more from desperation than belief. Yet society elevated them. They stood in the space between the living and the dead, and even if they did not save, they bore witness. They nodded solemnly. They signed certificates. They named the cause of death, even when that cause remained unknowable. One cannot fault the doctors of the age for all their failures. Many worked tirelessly, sincerely believing in their methods. Some saved lives. Others pushed boundaries. The profession was not devoid of compassion, but it was chained by ignorance, tradition, and tools that did not heal. By century's end, the tide began to turn. Germ theory gained traction. Sterilization took root. Anesthesia became safer. Public health reforms took shape. But for most of the Victorian period, the doctor's bag remained a box of terrors, filled with well-meant harm. When the bag finally closed at the end of a visit, families rarely felt peace. They cleaned the linens, burned old bandages, boiled water, and waited. They watched for improvement, for sleep, for breath that came easier, or they braced themselves for silence. A knock at the door brought help. Sometimes. But more often, it marked the beginning of a long and painful reckoning with the limits of medicine. Part 3. Leeches, Lard, and Laudanum. In the long shadows of a dim Victorian sickroom, it was not always the doctor who brought the cure. Sometimes it was a jar of wriggling creatures. Sometimes a wooden box lined with glass vials. More often, it was a kitchen cabinet filled with jars of fat, herbs, powders, and hope. The line between healing and harm was rarely clear, and the remedies used in that era were as strange as they were dangerous. The treatment of illness in the 19th century relied less on understanding and more on habit. Repetition gave a sense of control. A method, once tried and remembered, became law. Mothers passed it to daughters. Doctors passed it to students. Even when it didn't work, it remained. Among the most iconic and unsettling tools in the Victorian medical arsenal were leeches. Small, slimy, and blackish-brown, these freshwater worms were once more prized than gold in some corners of Europe. To many, they represented a return to natural healing. To others, they were the very image of medical horror. Stored in damp cloths or shallow tins, leeches were kept alive and transported with great care. They could only be used once every few weeks, and their hunger had to be just right. Too full, and they would refuse to bite. Too weak, and they might die before the work was done. The method was deceptively simple. A doctor or barber surgeon would take a single leech and press it gently onto the patient's skin, the temple, behind the ear, or the arm, depending on the supposed ailment. Within moments, the leech would latch on, its rows of tiny teeth creating a perfect Y-shaped incision. It drank without pause, swelling with the patient's blood until it resembled a dark grape. This process could take 20 minutes, sometimes more. During that time, the room would fall silent. The patient stared at the ceiling, the doctor watched the creature, and the family waited. It was believed that the removal of blood could lower fever, calm nerves, relieve pain, and balance the body. And so, many endured it. But the wound did not close quickly. Leeches injected an anticoagulant that prevented clotting. Blood could seep for hours, soaking bandages and bedding alike. Infection was a constant risk. Scars were common. Some patients required multiple leeches in one sitting. There are accounts of aristocrats receiving treatments involving dozens at once: faces, necks, even gums and inner eyelids. Leeches were not reserved only for humans. Veterinarians used them on horses. Surgeons applied them post-operation to reduce swelling. Apothecaries sold them by the dozen, wrapped in wet muslin. Their popularity reached such heights that supplies ran dangerously low. In France, laws were passed to protect leech habitats from overharvesting. Their use declined later in the century, but never disappeared entirely. Even as medical science advanced, old habits clung like damp fog to the edges of healing. Just as persistent, and far more widespread, was the use of animal fat as a curative. Lard, goose grease, and tallow featured in dozens of home remedies, slathered on skin and wrapped in cloth with all the solemnity of sacred ritual. One of the most common treatments for chest infections and coughs involved rubbing hot goose fat across the chest and back, then layering flannel or wool to trap the warmth. The pungent smell lingered for days. The skin often broke out in rashes. But for families with no access to doctors, or no money to pay one, it was better than nothing. Or so they believed. Some recipes added mustard, camphor, or turpentine to the fat, creating salves that burned and blistered. These poultices, once applied, were meant to draw illness out through the skin, a visible expulsion of inner poison. The suffering was accepted. Pain was interpreted as proof that the remedy was taking effect. On the skin, almost anything might be tried. Onion poultices for congestion. Boiled cabbage leaves for inflammation. Hot bricks wrapped in cloth for cramps. There were even mixtures of coal dust and molasses used to treat open wounds. Children were often the subjects of these applications. A wheezing child might be pinned down while a burning poultice was pressed to their chest. If they cried, it was chalked up to fussiness. If they fell silent, adults whispered that the cure had worked. No one questioned whether the child's breath had simply given out. And then there was laudanum. Of all the substances consumed in the Victorian age, none wove itself more tightly into daily life than this amber-hued tincture. A mixture of opium and alcohol, laudanum was both a painkiller and a dream. It flowed through cities in glass bottles, carried in pockets, tucked in cupboards, and administered with casual certainty. It dulled toothaches, soothed colic, eased the grief of widows, and quieted the howling of the poor. Doctors prescribed it for nearly everything: insomnia, diarrhea, coughs, fever, heartbreak. It was given to infants in drops, to the elderly in spoons. And because it numbed the mind as well as the body, it became not just a medicine, but a refuge. You could find it at chemist shops, sold under names like Godfrey's Cordial, Mother's Friend, or Infant's Preservative. Advertisements promised peace, rest, and strength. No prescription was needed. There were no restrictions on age, dosage, or frequency. Those who took it described a sense of floating, a warmth in the chest, a slowness of thought that made pain seem far away. Artists used it to deepen inspiration. Poets drifted into dreams. Women took it to quiet the mind after endless days of labor and silence. And yet, beneath the calm, addiction grew like mold. Withdrawal from laudanum was brutal. It brought vomiting, tremors, hallucinations, and dread. But few connected their suffering to the very substance meant to save them. They simply drank more, hoping the next dose would carry them through. Opium itself, imported from distant lands and refined in British factories, had become one of the empire's most profitable and destructive exports. While it devastated populations abroad, it slowly poisoned the veins of its own society. Laudanum claimed lives quietly. There were no epidemics, no public funerals, no protests. Just mothers who failed to wake, infants who slept too long, and husbands who drank their way into silence. Doctors, aware of its power but desperate for results, continued to prescribe it. Without antibiotics or reliable treatments, they leaned on what worked, or seemed to. It wasn't that they were cruel. It was that they had so little else to offer. Other narcotics followed in laudanum's footsteps. Morphine, cocaine, and chloral hydrate joined the Victorian medicine cabinet, each promising miracle relief and each leaving damage in its wake. Even heroin was introduced late in the century, first as a cough suppressant, then as a supposedly non-addictive substitute for morphine. In homes across Britain, pain was treated not with healing, but with oblivion. Even outside of chemical remedies, the logic of Victorian medicine often defied sense. Vinegar-soaked rags were wrapped around the neck to treat diphtheria. Turpentine was rubbed on the stomach to encourage urination. Raw meat was placed on wounds to feed the skin. Some healers recommended swallowing powdered lead. Others swore by enemas made from tobacco smoke. The medical journals of the era, while filled with new theories and bright ambitions, also carried letters from practitioners describing their latest experiments. One physician injected milk into a dying man's veins. Another tried goose grease suppositories. Trial and error was not just part of the process, it was the process. Yet for all this, there was no widespread panic. People accepted the danger of their cures. They had little choice. To go untreated was to suffer openly. To accept treatment was to risk everything. Between agony and uncertainty, most chose uncertainty. Women, especially, were subjected to the strangest of methods. For hysteria, physicians might prescribe total bed rest for months. The woman would be confined to her room, forbidden from reading, writing, or even speaking at length. Her meals were chosen for her. Her letters were censored. Sometimes, She was tied to the bed at night to keep her still. Other times, she was subjected to pelvic massage by male physicians, a grim ritual veiled in pseudoscience and control. Those who resisted were sent to asylums, where they might spend the rest of their lives under restraint, silence, and watchful eyes. For children, the situation was equally bleak. Teething powders, sold by the thousands, often contained mercury. These powders were rubbed into gums to ease the pain of emerging teeth. The result? Vomiting, weight loss, neurological damage. Many infants died without anyone realizing the cause. Their deaths were attributed to weakness, not poison. Even something as simple as a cold might lead to tragedy. With no antibiotics, bacterial infections spiraled quickly. Pneumonia was called the old man's friend because it offered a swift death. A fever left unchecked could melt the mind. A sore throat could swell and suffocate. The body was a battlefield, and the treatments, more often than not, turned the weapons inward. Still, some families developed their own rituals, careful balances between folk tradition and modern medicine. A grandmother might make tea from yarrow or peppermint. A neighbor might mix honey with garlic and lemon. These remedies, rooted in centuries of lived experience, were often gentler, more effective, and less dangerous than what the doctor carried in his bag. But trust in science was growing. The end of the century brought whispers of change. Germ theory gained followers. Sterilization entered hospitals. Public health campaigns warned against certain powders and potions. Slowly, dangerously, the culture of medicine began to shift. Yet the legacy of Leeches, Lard, and Laudanum lingered. It lived in memory, in scars, in old bottles kept on high shelves, in stories passed down from great-grandmothers who remembered the pain and the patience it demanded. The Victorian world had offered relief, but it came at a cost. Sometimes that cost was health. Sometimes it was dignity. Sometimes it was life itself. Part 4. The Chemist's Cabinet. Behind polished glass doors and brass-handled counters, the Victorian chemist's shop gleamed like a beacon of modernity. Blue and green bottles lined the shelves in precise rows, their colors catching sunlight that filtered through high street windows. The air smelled faintly of lavender, aniseed, and paraffin. On the surface, it felt safe, a sanctuary of health, order, and precision. But beneath the civility of the chemist's smile and the soft clink of mortar and pestle, the cabinet was a place of quiet danger. Each drawer and bottle, each paper-wrapped parcel or glass vial, held the power to soothe or to kill. The customer could not always tell the difference. Neither, at times, could the chemist. Victorian pharmacies, or apothecaries as they were often still called, stood at the intersection of tradition and science. They were more than dispensaries. They were part laboratory, part grocery, part confessional. Customers did not just collect prescriptions. They asked advice, sought comfort, and made quiet bargains with hope. The chemist stood behind the counter in a white coat or apron, a figure of trust. He knew your ailments, your secrets, your children's names. He knew what kept you awake at night. He also stocked poisons, and plenty of them. Arsenic sat beside antacids. Laudanum nestled in drawers next to peppermint oil. Morphine was stored not in vaults, but behind small cupboard doors. These substances weren't hidden or guarded. They were part of everyday business. Painkillers, nerve tonics, digestive powders, all contained substances now recognized as highly addictive or fatally toxic. And yet, they were sold openly, advertised boldly, and consumed widely. Arsenic, in particular, was a household name. It was used in flypaper, cosmetics, and tonics. Small doses were thought to stimulate appetite and improve complexion. Some women took it to brighten the eyes and smooth the skin. Men used it as a general tonic, stirred into wine or water before meals. Recipes were shared in women's magazines. There was even an underground belief that it made the voice sweeter and the breath purer. Few understood the slow damage it caused. Headaches, stomach pain, numbness in the limbs, a gradual weakening of the body until one day, it simply failed. Arsenic was tasteless and odorless. That made it easy to dose, and easy to misuse. Whether taken by accident or design, it was one of the era's most common causes of death. And still, it remained on pharmacy shelves for decades. Next to it, belladonna, the beautiful lady of the poison world, was another favorite. Extracted from deadly nightshade, it was used to dilate pupils, calm nerves, and even suppress coughs. It came in small brown bottles with handwritten labels, sold by the drop. One too many could stop the heart. Yet it was considered elegant, fashionable, refined. Strychnine, a powerful neurotoxin, also had its fans. In small amounts, it was believed to sharpen the mind and stimulate digestion. It was prescribed for fatigue, impotence, and nervous disorders. Though it caused muscle spasms and seizures in larger doses, it was still included in dozens of over-the-counter mixtures, from nerve pills to weight loss aids. Mercury compounds were used to treat syphilis and skin conditions. Calomel, a mercury-based laxative, was sold widely and often given to children. It created a sensation of cleansing, a purging of the bowels that was interpreted as therapeutic, even when it caused bloody stools and tooth loss. Camphor, turpentine, and carbolic acid were common antiseptics and decongestants. All were sold without instruction. All could burn, blind, or kill. Behind the counter, the chemist kept ledgers filled with formulas. These handwritten records passed from master to apprentice, sometimes from father to son. They listed recipes for ointments, syrups, lozenges, and salves. Some were harmless, herbal blends for sleep or digestion. Others were chemical cocktails with no true precedent, created on request or out of experimentation. If a customer arrived asking for something to calm the nerves, the chemist might prepare a mixture of laudanum, alcohol, and tincture of valerian. For a crying infant, he might suggest soothing syrup, a sweet, thick liquid that contained morphine or paregoric. For coughs, there was Dr. Bateman's pectoral drops, containing opium and camphor. For women's complaints, there were countless female regulators, often made from alcohol and narcotics. These products came in beautifully designed bottles. Gold lettering, floral etchings, embossed glass. The visual language of medicine was elegance, not warning. Labels made promises, sure relief, safe remedy, guaranteed cure. The truth, however, was often hidden in fine print, or not printed at all. Patent medicines, proprietary formulas sold under branded names, formed a booming industry. Traveling salesmen peddled them from wagons. Shop windows displayed them with pride. They were not subject to regulation, testing, or disclosure. A single bottle might contain 20 different ingredients, half of which were unknown even to the maker. Some of the most successful brands were international. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Ayer's cherry pectoral, and Dr. Williams' pink pills for pale people were household names. Each had a story. Each had an image. A kindly woman on the label. A stern gentleman in spectacles. A slogan that spoke of science and care. People trusted them, not because they were effective, but because they were constant. They were always on the shelf. Always within reach. And when life offered few other comforts, a spoonful of syrup was better than silence. In rural areas, where doctors were rare and hospitals distant, the chemist's cabinet became the only source of medical care. A farmer with a fever. A miner with a broken limb. A mother nursing a sick child. They all turned to the same place, not for diagnosis, but for relief. And yet, not all chemists were careless. Many took pride in their craft. They measured carefully, advised with sincerity, and tried to avoid harm. But they worked in a time of incomplete knowledge. They operated without the benefit of controlled trials, peer review, or modern chemistry. Their shelves were filled with contradiction, science beside folklore, cure beside curse. One of the unspoken truths of the Victorian pharmacy was its role in quiet deaths. Suicide, particularly among women, was often achieved with substances purchased over the counter. Arsenic, laudanum, and chloral hydrate were chosen for their availability. The pharmacist might ask no questions. Or if he did, he asked them gently, and then turned away. Coroners reported deaths as accidental or from natural causes when the evidence was unclear. And since so many medicines caused vomiting, convulsions, and sleep, their effects could be confused with any number of illnesses. Inquests were brief. Records incomplete. The cabinet stayed full. Some chemists became local legends, known not only for their remedies, but for their discretion. They kept the secrets of adulterous husbands, desperate wives, and sickly children. In a world where shame carried weight and illness bore stigma, they offered silence. By the final decades of the century, change began to stir. Medical journals raised concerns about patent medicines. Poisoning deaths prompted debates in Parliament. Campaigns for regulation gained traction. And eventually, the Pharmacy Act and other laws began to restrict what could be sold, and by whom. Labels became more informative. Ingredients were listed. Dangerous compounds required a license. But this was gradual. And for most of the Victorian period, the chemist's cabinet remained a Pandora's box, polished, fragrant, and filled with peril. In the dim morning light, when shops opened and street lamps still flickered, the first customers often came quietly. A man with a cough. A mother with a pale child. A woman who had been crying. They spoke in low tones, asked for familiar bottles, and left with brown paper parcels tucked under shawls or coats. The chemist wiped down the counter, reordered the jars, and waited for the next. He was not a villain. He was not a savior. He was simply a man in the middle, between illness and cure, knowledge and ignorance, caution and commerce. He did his best. Often, it wasn't enough. Part 5. Surgery without mercy. When a man in Victorian Britain heard that he would need surgery, the weight of the word fell heavy. It did not mean a quiet room with white sheets and gentle recovery. It meant something closer to mutilation. It meant pain, certainty of blood, and the very real chance that he would not live to tell the tale. There was no illusion about what surgery involved. No one expected comfort. No one expected mercy. The idea of being cut open, of enduring steel on flesh while awake and fully conscious, was a fear that gripped rich and poor alike. Yet sometimes, there was no other choice. When a wound turned foul, or a limb blackened, or a tumor pressed too hard against the ribs, the knife became the only road forward. And that road was steeped in suffering. Surgery in the early 1800s was not performed in sterile rooms or under calm lighting. It happened in wooden-floored chambers that smelled of blood and sweat. It took place on kitchen tables, in back rooms, or in makeshift hospital theaters with wooden benches stacked high with spectators. The smell of old blood lingered in the cracks of the floor. Sawdust was scattered to soak up the mess. The table was unpadded. The lighting was poor. The instruments, simple, brutal, were laid out like tools in a carpenter's workshop. Amputation was the most common major surgery. Arms, legs, fingers, even toes, once infected or shattered, had to come off. Gangrene moved fast. Broken bones that pierced the skin often turned septic within days. If the wound didn't kill, the infection would. And so the decision had to be made, quickly and without comfort. Remove the limb, or let the patient rot. In the early part of the century, Anesthesia did not exist. There were no injections, no gas, no merciful sleep. The only protection against pain was speed, and even that was not a guarantee. A good surgeon was judged not by how gentle he was, but by how fast he could finish the cut. Under 3 minutes was considered excellent. Under 2, miraculous. Patients were held down by assistants. Sometimes, they were tied to the table with leather straps or belts. Others gripped the hands of friends or bit into cloth. Screaming was expected. Passing out was hoped for. A strong heart helped, but even the bravest men wept or pleaded as the saw touched skin. The procedure began with a tourniquet, a leather strap wrapped tight above the site of the cut to reduce blood flow. Then came the knife. The first incision was swift, deep, and decisive. The skin was opened in a single motion, peeling back like fabric. The surgeon would then separate muscle from bone, exposing the limb structure in a matter of seconds. There was no hesitation. Hesitation caused pain. Hesitation caused death. The final step was the saw. Its teeth bit through bone with a coarse, rasping sound. A few swift passes, sometimes 6 or 7 strokes, and the limb came free. It was tossed aside, often landing in a bucket or on the floor. Bleeding was stopped with heated irons, pressed directly onto the open stump, or with thread and needle to tie off the vessels. The patient, pale and slick with sweat, was given water, or whiskey, or nothing at all. If he lived through the hour, his chances improved. But infection hovered like smoke. The instruments were not cleaned between patients. The table was wiped, not scrubbed. The surgeon wore a blood-crusted apron with pride. It signaled experience, not filth. Even as the century wore on, many doctors clung to the belief that pain was part of healing. Some argued that the suffering built character. Others insisted that the body's natural defenses worked best when fully awake. Theories varied. Suffering did not. Chloroform and ether appeared in the 1840s. Their arrival marked a turning point, or so it seemed. At first, they were used only rarely. Many doctors feared these agents. Administering them required skill. Too much, and the patient never woke. Too little, and the pain remained. Most physicians had no formal training in how to use them. Dosing was often done by instinct. A soaked cloth was held over the mouth and nose. Breathing slowed. Limbs twitched. Eyes rolled back. But unconsciousness could never be guaranteed. Still, as word spread of patients undergoing procedures without screaming, without flailing, curiosity grew. Some surgeons became converts. Others remained skeptical. Hospitals experimented in silence. Private surgeries became demonstrations. Those who had once passed out from pain now whispered of sleep and darkness, of waking to find the worst was over. But even with anesthesia, the danger of infection remained unchanged. No one understood germs. No one thought to clean the knives beyond a quick rinse in cold water. Some sharpened their tools on a leather strap seconds before the next operation. The floor beneath the table stayed stained. The smell was ever present. Hands went unwashed. Bandages were reused. Blood crusted beneath fingernails. A new patient might be operated on with the same saw used minutes earlier, still wet with another man's suffering. Joseph Lister, a quiet and methodical Scottish surgeon, began to question this practice in the 1860s. Influenced by Louis Pasteur's theories on microorganisms, he proposed a shocking idea that invisible agents, germs, caused infection. He introduced carbolic acid to sterilize instruments and wounds. He cleaned his hands. He sprayed the air. And for the first time, he saw surgical survival rates rise. Colleagues scoffed at first. Some called his methods unnecessary. Others found the carbolic spray intolerable. It burned the skin, stung the eyes, and smelled like rot. But Lister pressed on, and over time, the evidence became impossible to ignore. By the end of the century, antiseptic surgery had begun to take hold. Gloves were introduced. Aprons were washed. Instruments were boiled. The death rate from post-surgical infection began to fall. But progress was slow and uneven. Many hospitals lagged behind. In rural towns and poorhouses, the old ways endured. Surgeons continued to operate in rooms with open windows and barking dogs. They wiped their tools on their coats. They cut and stitched with confidence, knowing that skill and certainty were still more valued than hygiene. Women, especially, suffered under the surgical knife. Procedures for female troubles ranged from uterine surgery to ovariectomies, the removal of ovaries, performed under crude conditions and justified by vague diagnoses of hysteria or nervous disorder. Consent was often assumed. Pain was inevitable. Recovery was a long crawl through fever and shame. Even childbirth was not spared. When labor failed, doctors used forceps to pull the child free, often causing permanent injury to mother or baby. In some cases, the infant was sacrificed to save the mother. In others, both were lost. And through it all, the tools remained the same. A scalpel, narrow and sharp. A bone saw, wide and heavy. Needles made of brass or silver, thick as knitting pins. Sutures from silk or gut. Forceps with chipped enamel. Clamps and spreaders. Sponges black with blood. These were the surgeon's instruments. Not of healing, but of survival. Operating theaters, literal theaters, with seats rising around the table, drew crowds of medical students and observers. A particularly famous surgeon could draw hundreds to witness a difficult case. There were no curtains, no privacy. The patient lay exposed, surrounded by eyes, breath, and murmurs. Pain was part of the lesson. It was in one of these theaters, at St. Bartholomew's in London, that one of the most infamous surgical stories took place. The surgeon was Robert Liston, known as the fastest blade in the West End. In one operation, he amputated a leg in under 3 minutes. But in his haste, he also sliced the fingers off his assistant and nicked the coat of a bystander. All 3 later died, one from infection, one from shock, and the third, it said, from fright. It remains the only recorded surgery with a 300% mortality rate. Such stories were rare, but they captured the spirit of the age, brutal, urgent, and deeply flawed. The pain of surgery was not just physical. It left marks on the mind, too. Patients who survived often suffered nightmares, tremors, or persistent dread. Children became mute. Adults avoided hospitals at all costs. The memory of the table, the saw, the restraint, it lingered long after the wounds had closed. And yet, there were triumphs. A few men and women lived because of those surgeries. Tumors removed. Gallstones cut away. Broken limbs repaired. The line between barbarism and bravery was thin, but it existed. As the Victorian century turned, the face of surgery began to change. Hospitals became cleaner. Instruments gleamed without blood. Nurses sterilized tools. Masks appeared. Gloves became standard. Pain, while not eliminated, was no longer expected. Mercy entered the room, slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. Still, the shadow of the old ways remained. It whispered in the corners of operating theaters. It lived in the stories told by grandfathers to grandchildren. It haunted the drawers where old tools were kept, blackened with time. In that long and terrible age of unmerciful surgery, lives were saved, but so many were lost. The cost was high. The screams were real. The blade was quick. But the pain was endless. Part 6. Wards of Woe. The moment you stepped inside a Victorian hospital, the smell took hold. It was sharp, sour, and inescapable, a bitter blend of blood, urine, sweat, carbolic acid, old bandages, and fear. No matter how clean the floor looked, no matter how recently the sheets had been changed, the scent of suffering clung to every surface. The corridors were long and often dark. Windows, if there were any, let in little light through soot-stained glass. Walls were dull with grime or faded paint, and ceilings peeled where dampness settled. In winter, the chill crawled under doors and into bones. In summer, the heat clung like a fever. There was no comfort here. These were not places built for rest. They were machines for managing death. Beds stood side by side, often only inches apart. Iron frames creaked when the wind passed through a broken pane. Straw mattresses sagged under the weight of disease. Sheets, once white, showed permanent stains. Between the beds, a narrow path allowed nurses to pass. Visitors squeezed through when they could, careful not to touch anything or anyone for too long. Some wards held 40, 50, even 60 patients at once. There were no private rooms. Curtains, if provided, offered only a symbolic gesture of dignity. Conversations bled from one bed to the next. So did coughing. So did infection. In surgical wards, the air carried the metallic scent of open wounds and cauterized flesh. Flies buzzed lazily in the corners. Bowls of soiled dressings sat uncovered beside beds. Nurses changed bandages with bare hands, then moved on to the next patient without pause. The idea of sterilization was still new, still controversial. And so infections spread as easily as gossip. Wounds turned green. Stumps leaked pus. Eyes clouded from fever. In the night, the soft moaning of the dying blended with the groans of those who feared they might be next. There were no machines to monitor vitals. No alarms, no monitors, no digital records. Instead, nurses relied on touch and instinct. They felt for pulses. They watched the rise and fall of the chest. They noted which patients still ate, which ones no longer cried out, and which had begun to stare too long at the ceiling. Pain relief was rare and unreliable. Laudanum was offered when available, but supplies were limited. Chloroform might be used during surgery, but not during recovery. Most patients endured their suffering in silence, not by choice, but by expectation. To complain was to risk scorn. To scream was to disturb others. To remain quiet was considered noble. The nurses who worked in these wards were not the gentle, trained professionals we imagine today. In the early part of the century, most were uneducated, overworked, and underpaid. Many had come from backgrounds of poverty themselves. A number had histories as servants or even as criminals. Hospital work was seen as undesirable, a job for the desperate. Cleanliness, punctuality, discipline, these things were not always enforced. Nurses might arrive late, unwashed, and in soiled aprons. They might ignore their charges for hours. Some were known to steal from patients, drink on the job, or disappear when needed most. Others tried their best under impossible circumstances, without training, support, or proper supplies. Male orderlies performed the heavier tasks, lifting, restraining, carrying the dead, but the care of patients fell largely to women. And in some hospitals, that care was minimal. It wasn't until the work of Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War that true reform began. She saw firsthand how filth and neglect were killing more soldiers than bullets. She introduced standards of cleanliness, order, and ventilation. She insisted on hand washing, fresh air, and proper record keeping. Her efforts reduced mortality rates dramatically. When she returned to Britain, she brought those reforms with her. She founded training schools for nurses. She wrote extensively on hospital design and hygiene. Slowly, her ideas began to take hold. By the latter half of the century, New hospitals were built with better ventilation, more windows, and organized ward layouts. Nurses began to wear uniforms. Training became more structured. Cleanliness was emphasized. But even so, most hospitals remained overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded. Public hospitals in urban centers like London, Manchester, and Birmingham struggled under the weight of demand. Every year, more people poured into cities, drawn by industrial jobs, fleeing rural poverty, and with them came illness. Tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera, industrial accidents, burns, amputations, childbirth complications, mental illness, malnutrition, venereal disease. Each came with its own agonies. Each came through the hospital doors. There were separate wards for men and women, sometimes for children. In some institutions, charity patients were housed apart from paying ones. The poor received basic care, a cot, perhaps soup or bread, and minimal attention. Wealthier patients could pay for a bed in a quieter corner, a nurse of their own, even a private room if the hospital offered it. But even then, the risk of infection remained high. A wealthy man recovering from a broken leg might catch pneumonia from the man in the next bed. A woman treated for childbirth fever might contract sepsis during a routine cleaning. Disease did not respect coin. Maternity wards were among the most harrowing. Women gave birth in rows, attended by overworked midwives or young doctors fresh from school. Instruments were reused without sterilization. Sheets were rarely changed between deliveries. Hands went unwashed. Many mothers developed puerperal fever, a postnatal infection that spread like wildfire through hospitals. Entire wards of new mothers died within days of giving birth. Some doctors still resisted the idea of germs. They scoffed at the notion that something invisible could kill. They saw washing as an unnecessary delay. Others, following the lead of Ignaz Semmelweis and Joseph Lister, began to implement antiseptic methods. But for every ward that embraced change, another clung to the past. The mental wards, or asylums, were a world of their own. Patients deemed mad were often separated from the rest, kept behind locked doors, restrained in straitjackets or iron cuffs. Some screamed day and night. Others sat in corners, rocking, humming, or weeping without end. Treatment was limited. Ice baths, purgatives, confinement, these were the tools of the asylum. Few recovered. Most were forgotten. Children's wards were no less grim. Infants shared cribs. Toddlers wailed beside dying grandparents. Rickets, measles, diphtheria, and scarlet fever claimed young lives daily. Nurses did what they could, often with no more than a rag and a bottle of carbolic. Parents waited outside, hoping for good news, dreading a knock at the door. There was no real silence in these hospitals. Even at night, the coughing continued. The rustle of sheets. The clatter of pails. The soft prayers whispered into the dark. When death came, it came quietly. A nurse might notice a stillness. A hand grown cold. Eyes no longer blinking. The body was covered with a sheet. The name was added to a register. Belongings, if any, were collected. Sometimes a family was notified. Sometimes not. Bodies were wheeled away to the mortuary. Beds were scrubbed, or not. A new patient was brought in within hours. The cycle resumed. And yet, despite the horror, people continued to come. Because they had nowhere else to go. Because the hospital, however grim, was a place of last resort. A sliver of hope. A place where, just maybe, someone might survive. Some did. A few walked out weeks later, thinner, quieter, but alive. They told stories of kind nurses, lucky recoveries, and doctors who tried. Others never left. Their names faded from memory. Their pain, recorded only in ink and smudges. As the century drew to a close, reforms accelerated. Clean water was introduced. Ventilation improved. Surgical instruments were sterilized more consistently. Training programs for nurses became more widespread. Nightingale's vision of modern hospitals took root. But the shadow of those early wards lingered. The smell, the groans, the cramped beds, the endless rows of the dying. These were the wards of woe. And for those who passed through them, they were unforgettable. Part 7. The Poor Man's Plague. Disease in the Victorian era was never an equal affliction. It did not fall randomly, nor did it sweep through society with blind fury. Illness had a keen sense of direction. It crept into alleyways, climbed rickety staircases, slid beneath the doors of tenements, and settled itself among the poor. While the wealthy employed private physicians and retreated to countryside villas at the first sign of fever, the laboring classes had nowhere to run. For the poor, sickness was not an interruption. It was a part of life, familiar, constant, and always waiting. In the crowded neighborhoods of cities like London, Liverpool, and Manchester, entire families lived in a single damp room. The walls, dark with mildew, sweated in the summer and wept in the rain. Floorboards gaped. Rats nested in corners. The air was thick with soot from nearby chimneys and the sour breath of too many people packed too tightly together. Cradles stood next to cook stoves. Buckets for waste sat beside beds. Water came from a communal pump, if it came at all. Toilet facilities, when they existed, were shared among dozens. Disease, in such conditions, did not need to travel far. It found all it needed within arm's reach. Children bore the brunt of it. Their bodies, still forming, were easy prey for infection. Measles swept through them like wildfire. Scarlet fever left them with damaged hearts. Tuberculosis took them slowly, bone by bone, breath by breath. Many never reached their 5th birthday. For working-class families, the burial of a child was a known grief. Coffins came small and frequent. The adults fared no better. Laborious returned from the factory floor with raw lungs and blistered hands, coughing into the night. Women, often both mothers and wage earners, worked in laundries and sweatshop before cooking for families and nursing the sick. Nutrition was minimal. Sleep was broken. Rest was a luxury. With so little strength and so few resources, illness struck like a hammer. A single bout of pneumonia could empty a home of warmth and leave a child without a father. An infected cut, ignored for a day too long, could mean gangrene. The flu, which came in waves, claimed the weak with quiet ease. And yet, there was no safety net. No national health system. No guaranteed care. The poor relied on charity hospitals, overcrowded clinics, or the dreaded workhouse infirmaries. Places where care was basic, if it came at all, and the stigma of poverty hung heavy over every interaction. In these places, patients were sorted not just by illness, but by status. The deserving poor, widows, the disabled, those considered morally sound, might be treated with relative dignity. The undeserving, drinkers, the idle, the feeble-minded, were given less, expected to endure more, and often dismissed entirely. The workhouse was, for many, the last resort. Established under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, it was designed less as relief and more as deterrent. Conditions were deliberately harsh. Families were separated upon entry. Meals were meager. Clothing was uniform. Silence was enforced. If one fell ill inside a workhouse, the infirmary offered little comfort. Beds were hard and closely packed. Medicines were scarce. The staff was overworked, often indifferent. Deaths were common, and when they came, they were processed quickly. There were few mourners, few prayers. Outside the workhouse, The parish doctor served the destitute, paid a modest stipend to treat the indigent in his district. He traveled by foot or cart, carrying a bag with little more than basic tools and small bottles of laudanum or castor oil. He might visit a mother in labor, a child with fever, an elderly man dying by inches, and then hurry to the next house, and the next. He worked not from hope, but from duty. His visits were short, his cures limited, and yet, for many, he was the only option. Tuberculosis, the great shadow of the era, was often called the poor man's plague. It fed on cold rooms, poor diet, damp air, and constant fatigue. It lingered in narrow stairwells, waited in factory corners, rode the breath of the coughing into the lungs of the young. It didn't kill quickly. It watched its victims waste away, coughing blood, losing weight, growing pale and weak until the body could give no more. It hollowed out families one by one. And all the while, the well-off observed from afar, romanticizing the look of consumption, the flushed cheeks, the delicate hands, the sad, lovely eyes. They called it poetic, beautiful, even fashionable. But in the slums, it was anything but. Cholera struck faster. Waterborne and vicious, it thrived in the same places people drank and washed and cleaned their food. The rich had private water supplies, filtered or drawn from cleaner sources. The poor had public pumps and shared buckets. When the disease hit, it was merciless. A healthy man could be dead in a day. The diarrhea came first, violent, dehydrating, then vomiting, muscle cramps, blue skin, delirium, and death. Entire streets were emptied in days. Bodies piled. Officials burned clothing and bedding. Whole houses were sealed. But the pumps kept flowing. And so did the dying. John Snow, a physician with a growing suspicion of the waterborne theory, mapped a cholera outbreak in Soho to a single pump on Broad Street. He had the handle removed. Cases dropped. His findings changed medical understanding, but only slowly. For many years after, the poor still drank from contaminated wells. Municipal investment in sewage and clean water came late, and reluctantly. Typhus, smallpox, diphtheria, and countless lesser-known fevers also made their rounds through the laboring classes. Each found a home in places where the body was already stretched thin. In the winter months, respiratory illnesses surged. In the summer, dysentery and foodborne disease took their turn. There was no off-season, only different kinds of death. And with each new wave, there came judgment. Writers and politicians, many of them shielded by money and privilege, blamed the poor for their suffering. They said slum dwellers were dirty, lazy, morally weak. They pointed to vice, to drink, to ignorance. Few considered the structural violence of 10-hour shifts, starvation wages, and dangerous housing. Few saw the way the system produced sickness and then blamed its victims. Even charity was conditional. To receive a bowl of soup or a doctor's visit, one had to behave properly. One had to smile, to beg politely, to show gratitude. Anger was punished. Pride was disqualifying. And if you died, your family might not be allowed to take the body unless burial costs were paid in advance. The well-off, when confronted with illness, called for doctors, paid for isolation, arranged holidays by the sea. The poor went on working, coughing into their gloves, swallowing bile, pushing carts or sewing buttons while their bodies betrayed them. Children were sent to factories while still weak from fever. Men limped to foundries on infected feet. Women took in laundry while bleeding from childbirth. To stop working was to stop eating. And so disease was endured. Not conquered. Not healed. Endured. By the late 1800s, reformers began to make noise. Sanitary inspectors toured slums. Reports were written. Maps were drawn. Newspapers published illustrations of filth and overcrowding. Campaigners like Octavia Hill and Edwin Chadwick called for change, some motivated by compassion, others by fear of contagion spreading to wealthier districts. Small victories followed. Streets were paved. Garbage was removed. Clean water came to more homes. Public health acts were passed. But for most of the century, these improvements came too late for too many. By then, millions had already suffered, and many had died, not because they were sick, but because they were poor. It wasn't just disease that claimed them. It was the conditions that bred it, the indifference that allowed it, the distance between classes that hid its true cost. In the end, the poor man's plague was not one disease. It was all of them. Layered, constant, unrelenting. It was the bruise on the child's chest that turned dark and never healed. It was the woman coughing into her apron while stirring soup. It was the old man who sat by the window and waited for death without making a sound. It was the breath of the city itself, fouled, infected, and ignored. Part 8. Women in Pain. In the Victorian age, a woman's suffering was rarely believed, and almost never understood. When her body ached or her nerves frayed, when her mind seemed distant or her spirit unsettled, the response from physicians was often not concern, but control. She was not asked how she felt, she was told what she was. Hysterical, nervous, fragile, melancholic, imbalanced, unwell in some way that rarely needed explanation, only observation, and almost always submission. Her pain, however real, was filtered through a lens of suspicion and silence. From the drawing rooms of the upper class to the cramped kitchens of the poor, women endured an array of physical and emotional afflictions with little hope of proper diagnosis. Menstruation, childbirth, menopause, grief, exhaustion, and chronic illness were all conditions that marked a woman's life. But the medical world responded with confusion, judgment, and often the wrong remedy entirely. The catch-all term hysteria served as a physician's escape hatch, a diagnosis that required no understanding, no proof, and no treatment beyond management. The word itself came from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. It implied that the uterus, and the uterus alone, was the seat of a woman's mental and emotional troubles. Doctors believed that a wandering womb, dissatisfied with its place in the body, could migrate within, pressing on other organs and disturbing the mind. This ancient and absurd theory, long discredited in modern times, remained a core idea well into the 19th century. It shaped treatment. It shaped attitudes. It shaped lives. Women who wept without cause were labeled hysterical. So were women who refused marriage, expressed sexual desire, read too much, disobeyed husbands, or simply asked too many questions. A young woman who struggled with anxiety was not nervous, she was unruly. A mother who lost a child and couldn't stop crying was not in mourning, she was mentally unstable. For every symptom a man might describe as physical, women were expected to translate theirs into quietness or shame. A dull ache in the back, hysteria, trouble sleeping, nerves, chronic fatigue, female weakness. And when women pushed back, when they demanded real answers, they were often punished with confinement or invasive procedures. One of the most disturbing practices to emerge from this culture of mistrust was the so-called rest cure. Popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell in the United States and adopted by many Victorian doctors in Britain, the treatment involved isolating a woman in a quiet room, forbidding her from engaging in any mental or physical activity. She was not allowed to read. She could not write. She was often fed a fatty, bland diet, given frequent massages, and required to lie in bed for weeks or even months. Conversation was limited. Visitors discouraged. Resistance interpreted as proof of illness. The goal, according to the doctrine, was to restore the woman's nervous system through passivity and dependence. What it often achieved instead was emotional collapse. Some women lost their ability to concentrate. Others became paranoid. A few never fully recovered. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who endured the rest cure herself, later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a chilling account of a woman driven to madness by medical isolation. While upper-class women were subjected to silence, working-class women suffered from exposure to labor, to childbirth without care, to endless fatigue, to doctors who saw them as vessels and not voices. A factory girl with pelvic pain was less likely to receive any diagnosis at all. She might be told to rest, to work harder, or to stop exaggerating. Menstruation, a routine part of every woman's life, was pathologized. Doctors wrote volumes on menstrual madness, attributing everything from irritability to criminal behavior to the presence or absence of a period. Girls were taught to fear their bodies, to hide their discomfort, and to stay silent about irregularity or pain. And then there was childbirth. No part of a woman's experience carried more physical risk and received less consistent care. In poor neighborhoods, midwives still oversaw most births. Some were skilled and compassionate. Others lacked training and resources. In wealthier circles, doctors increasingly inserted themselves into the delivery process, often with disastrous results. Forceps were used with little warning or consent. Chloroform, introduced as a form of anesthesia, was applied without understanding of its effects on mother or child. Puerperal fever, the dreaded postpartum infection, killed thousands. It was spread not by fate or misfortune, but by the unwashed hands of male physicians moving from one delivery to the next without pause. Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician, discovered that hand-washing with chlorinated lime could drastically reduce mortality. He published his findings. He begged colleagues to adopt the practice. He was mocked, ridiculed, and dismissed. Women continued to die. Some doctors believed pain in childbirth was part of a divine order, that women, descended from Eve, were meant to suffer in bringing forth life. Others saw the opportunity to study the female body with a kind of cold curiosity. They performed experiments. They administered new drugs. They learned, often at the patient's expense. In gynecology, a fledgling field in the Victorian period, the cruelty could be even more pronounced. Women were subjected to vaginal examinations with crude, unheated instruments. Procedures were done without anesthesia. Biopsies, scrapings, and surgeries were conducted with minimal explanation. If the woman resisted or cried, she was dismissed as overly sensitive. Some surgeons went further. J. Marion Sims, considered the father of modern gynecology, developed many of his techniques by experimenting on enslaved women in the United States, women who could not consent and had no choice but to endure. His tools and methods made their way into British medicine. His statue stood for over a century. Even mental illness, when it affected women, was treated with suspicion and often violence. Depression, anxiety, grief, these were rarely seen as legitimate conditions. Women who struggled to cope were institutionalized. They were restrained. They were subjected to ice baths, purgatives, electric shock, or simply locked away and forgotten. Wives were committed by husbands, daughters by fathers. A woman's word carried little weight once her behavior was called into question. Her possessions could be taken, her letters censored, her autonomy erased. And yet, despite all this, women endured. They whispered remedies to one another. They comforted each other in childbirth. They risked arrest to access contraception, to terminate pregnancies, to live as they saw fit. Some fought back with words. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson became the first woman to qualify as a doctor in Britain. She founded hospitals. She trained others. Sophia Jex-Blake followed, and with her came a wave of women who would challenge the medical establishment and reshape it from within. Others fought with ink. Writers like Florence Nightingale, though known for nursing, also penned fierce critiques of how women were treated by doctors. Their influence grew. Their words moved slowly through universities and hospitals, demanding change. And change came, but slowly, unevenly, painfully. By the end of the century, women were gaining a foothold in medicine, both as practitioners and as patients whose voices could no longer be so easily silenced. But the legacy of misunderstanding remained. The assumption that women were weaker, that their minds were less stable, that their pain mattered less. In the quiet of countless Victorian bedrooms, women lay with cramps, infections, tumors, and silent dread. They swallowed powders that numbed them. They endured procedures that harmed them. They listened as their pain was dismissed as imagination. They were called delicate. They were told to smile. They were prescribed sleep instead of answers. And still, they lived. They resisted. They remembered. Part 9. The Mad and the Damned. The walls of the Victorian asylum were high for a reason. They were meant to contain not just the patients, but the fear and discomfort of the outside world. Inside, society placed those it could not understand, would not listen to, or no longer wish to see. The mad, the melancholic, the eccentric, the forgotten, they were all sent behind iron gates, where reason ended and silence began. To be declared insane in Victorian Britain required no grand outburst or violent act. A woman might be committed for grieving too long. A man, for talking to himself in the street. A mother, for arguing with her husband. A daughter, for refusing marriage. Melancholia, hysteria, religious delusion, sexual confusion. These were the broad, ill-defined terms that could land someone in an asylum indefinitely. The process was deceptively simple. 2 doctors were needed. A family member, employer, or neighbor provided a complaint. A brief examination followed, rarely longer than a conversation. The papers were signed. The cart arrived. And the patient disappeared. Some were taken with force. Others went quietly, holding on to hope that help might be found. Most had no idea what lay ahead. The asylum buildings themselves were imposing structures, vast, symmetrical, and built to impress as much as contain. Constructed on the edges of towns or deep in the countryside, they were often surrounded by fields, gardens, and tall stone walls. The outer facade promised order and progress. Inside, however, the truth was more complex. Long corridors echoed with footsteps. Doors slammed in the distance. Gas lamps hissed. Windows were barred or too high to reach. Furniture was sparse, functional, nailed down. The smell of bleach, soap, and something harder to name hung in the air, a stale trace of too many bodies in too small a space. Patients were sorted by gender, by diagnosis, by behavior. The quiet were placed in one ward. The agitated in another. Those considered dangerous were locked away, restrained, or placed in isolation. Diagnoses were crude. Treatments inconsistent. For many, their only true illness was poverty, grief, or deviation from social norms. Inside the asylum, time moved differently. Days were structured, rigid, repetitive. Wake up, dress, wash, eat, walk the grounds, if permitted, sit in silence, endure observation, repeat. There was little therapy, at least as we would recognize it today. Instead, there were cold baths to calm the nerves. Ice water poured over heads. Rotating chairs designed to spin patients into quiet compliance. Blistering, bleeding, purging, holdovers from earlier centuries, still appeared in records. The goal was not healing. It was obedience. Restraints were common. Straitjackets, leather cuffs, seclusion rooms with padded walls and locked doors. Patients who screamed were gagged. Those who refused food were force-fed. Some were kept in solitary confinement for weeks. Many asylums claimed to offer moral treatment, a method that promoted routine, cleanliness, and calm surroundings as a path to mental recovery. In theory, this was a step forward. In practice, it depended entirely on funding, staffing, and the humanity of those in charge. Some institutions made real effort. Others sank into cruelty masked as care. The staff, doctors, attendants, nurses, varied widely in skill and compassion. Some were deeply committed, underpaid, and overwhelmed. Others saw patients as objects, burdens, or threats. Abuse, both physical and emotional, was not uncommon. Complaints were ignored. Punishments went unrecorded. Women were especially vulnerable. Their diagnoses often reflected social discomfort rather than medical reality. Hysteria, nymphomania, and moral insanity were vague terms used to police behavior. A woman who read too much, spoke too loudly, or resisted domestic life might be labeled mad. In some cases, husbands committed wives to remove them from the home. Fathers committed daughters who disobeyed. The law rarely questioned such decisions. Once inside, women had no legal voice. They were treated as patients, not as people. Pregnancy complicated matters further. Unmarried women who became pregnant were often labeled mentally unstable, especially if they refused to reveal the father or insisted on keeping the child. Some were sent to asylums under the pretext of moral correction. Their children, if born, were taken. The women remained. Men, too, suffered under the weight of misdiagnosis. Soldiers returned from battle with what we now know as trauma or post-traumatic stress, then called soldier's heart or melancholia. They were placed in wards and given little more than quiet and confinement. Poets, artists, thinkers who saw the world differently were often misunderstood, their creativity mistaken for delusion. Homosexuality was considered a mental illness, punishable not just by prison but by forced treatment. Electroshock therapy, isolation, castration. Medical journals of the time described these practices without hesitation, coldly, methodically. Children, when committed, were often forgotten. Orphaned, disabled, or simply too unruly for their families to handle, they were placed in juvenile wards. Many grew up inside, knowing nothing else. Education was minimal. Care inconsistent. Their futures, dim. Records from the period are filled with haunting details. Patients described as talkative, moody, too fond of books. Others marked as incurable within a week of arrival. Some were discharged after years, changed beyond recognition. Others died inside, their bodies buried in unmarked graves on asylum grounds. Death came from illness, injury, or despair. Suicide was common, despite efforts to prevent it. Hanging, poisoning, starvation. Patients used whatever they could find. Some succeeded. Others were punished for the attempt. Yet even within this bleak world, moments of dignity emerged. A kind nurse who listened. A doctor who questioned the system. A patient who, through art or writing, found a voice. Some recovered, in part or whole. Some were released and began new lives. But many more faded into the background, catalogued, labeled, forgotten. By the late 1800s, reforms began to stir. Campaigners called for oversight. New laws were proposed to limit wrongful commitment. Inspectors were appointed. Public attitudes shifted slowly. The image of the madman as dangerous and subhuman began to crack. Asylum design changed. More light. More green spaces. More privacy. Some institutions experimented with occupational therapy, allowing patients to paint, garden, or read. Advances in neurology, though still rudimentary, offered new theories. But the stigma remained. To have been institutionalized was to carry a mark. Many who left the asylum found it difficult to find work, family, or belonging. They had been judged, once, and judgment, in the Victorian world, was rarely revoked. The idea of madness, of who was considered sane and who was not, was shaped not just by medicine, but by culture, gender, class, and fear. It was a tool, sometimes used to help, but more often used to exclude. And for those placed behind asylum walls, the line between care and punishment was never clear. Outside, the world moved on. Trains ran. Telegraphs clicked. Empires expanded. But inside the asylums, time froze. Days blurred. Voices echoed. Hope faded. And the mad, or those declared so, endured, unseen and unheard. Part 10. Quacks and Charlatans. In the streets of Victorian Britain, medicine was not just practiced, it was performed. It danced on soapboxes, shouted from stagecoaches, and dripped from golden-lettered bottles in apothecary windows. The average citizen could scarcely walk a city block without encountering a cure for something: a powder for nerves, a syrup for coughs, a tonic for vigor, or an elixir to banish age itself. And behind many of these promises stood men, and sometimes women, whose credentials were paper-thin, whose ethics were non-existent, and whose flair for drama rivaled any actor on the West End. They were the quacks and the charlatans, smooth-talking healers, self-proclaimed doctors, wandering salesmen, and theatrical lecturers who operated on the margins of medicine, weaving science with spectacle and deceit. They thrived in a world where pain was common, hope was scarce, and regulation had not yet found its grip. It was a golden age for deception, because it was an age of desperation. The ordinary Victorian suffered from ailments that modern medicine could not yet explain, much less cure. Tuberculosis dragged on for years. Syphilis ravaged quietly. Arthritis twisted hands and spines. Digestive complaints, nervous exhaustion, chronic pain, all were met with shrugs, vague prescriptions, or ineffective treatments. Into this void stepped the self-appointed saviors, bearing scrolls of testimonials and trunks full of mystery. One might appear in a marketplace wearing a stovepipe hat and a crimson coat, voice booming with confidence. Another arrived in a painted wagon, flanked by assistants dressed as nurses or clergymen. Some spoke with foreign accents, claiming knowledge from distant lands: Egypt, India, China, real or imagined. Others dressed as gentlemen scientists, with pocket watches, spectacles, and neatly trimmed beards. They offered cures for everything: cancer, dropsy, gout, madness, baldness, sterility, and they sold them with flair, often combining performance with diagnosis. A trembling hand might be declared a sign of imbalanced humors. A child's crying, a curse of the liver. A weary mother, infected with city air. All this, they said, could be reversed, for a modest price. Bottles lined their tables. Some were filled with colored water, others with mixtures of opium, alcohol, cocaine, or herbal extracts with potent effects. Most came without labels or instructions. Some had names like Dr. Blake's Universal Tonic, Mother Thornton's Life Elixir, or Professor Balthazar's Vital Drops. All promised results. Testimonials, often invented, were read aloud to the crowd. Cured in 3 days. My eyesight restored. My husband's gout vanished after 1 bottle. Letters were displayed, their handwriting always suspiciously similar. Coins changed hands. Bottles vanished into baskets. The crowd moved on, and the seller packed up, ready to flee at the first sign of suspicion. Some quacks stayed mobile, traveling from town to town to avoid legal trouble or angry customers. Others opened static clinics or rented rooms above taverns. There, they posed as specialists in female complaints, private diseases, or manly vigor. These vague categories attracted the anxious, the ashamed, and the desperate, people unwilling or unable to see a proper physician. One of the most common targets for medical fraud was sexual health. In a society obsessed with propriety but riddled with venereal disease, many suffered in silence. Men feared impotence, infertility, or syphilitic decay. Women, taught to speak of nothing below the waist, endured infections, pain, and bleeding without guidance. Into this silence stepped the quack, armed with powders, salves, and alarming language. They published pamphlets warning of debilitating habits and nocturnal emissions, promising discretion and cure. Remedies often did more harm than good. Mercury remained a common ingredient in treatments for syphilis, despite its toxicity. Some tonics contained turpentine or arsenic. A few worked, mostly by numbing pain or inducing euphoria, but none addressed the root causes. Mail-order cures became popular. A man in Leeds could write to a mysterious doctor in London and receive a brown package 3 days later. Inside, a bottle, a folded instruction sheet, and a warning not to tell anyone. The language was vague, but the business model was precise. The quack's greatest weapon wasn't chemistry, it was psychology. He knew his audience. He understood fear. He exploited secrecy. And he sold not just medicine, but hope. Advertising was his ally. Newspapers ran full-page spreads filled with grandiose claims. Posters plastered walls. Handbills fluttered through doorways. No medical regulation prevented these lies. Not yet. And so, the marketplace of health was loud, crowded, and treacherous. Some frauds worked under the guise of spiritual healing. They claimed divine insight, laying hands on the sick, speaking in tongues, or invoking mystical forces. Others masqueraded as Eastern doctors, offering Oriental cures and sacred herbs. Their costumes changed. Their promises did not. In wealthier circles, the charlatan adapted. He wore better clothes. He spoke more softly. He leased offices with marble entryways and private waiting rooms. He catered to ladies and gentlemen too embarrassed to speak of their ailments openly. His remedies came in elegant packaging. His fees were high. His advice, vague but comforting. One well-known example was the rise of homeopathy, a system of medicine based on the principle that like cures like, using diluted substances to trigger the body's healing response. While not fraudulent in intent, it attracted its share of opportunists, sellers who diluted remedies to absurd degrees, charged exorbitant fees, and discouraged patients from seeking more effective care. Then there were the bone setters, tooth pullers, and magnetic healers. Some operated on street corners. Others offered their services in parlors or apothecaries. A few had real skill. Most relied on theatrics. They cracked joints, waved magnets over bodies, and claimed results no one could verify. One popular device was the electrogalvanic belt, a battery-powered contraption worn around the waist to stimulate the organs. It promised vitality, restored youth, and sexual vigor. It also burned the skin and delivered unpredictable shocks. Still, it sold by the thousands. Some quacks were dangerous. A few were deadly. Children, given soothing syrups filled with morphine, slipped into comas. Elderly patients drank arsenic for joint pain and never woke. Women with uterine tumors took tonics that hastened bleeding. And yet, prosecutions were rare. The victims were often poor, ashamed, or buried quickly. The seller had moved on. By the 1850s and 1860s, public concern began to grow. Medical journals published critiques. Doctors called for standards. A few high-profile scandals, including mass poisonings and the death of prominent figures, pushed Parliament to act. In 1858, the Medical Act established the General Medical Council and a formal register of licensed physicians. Only those listed could legally call themselves doctors. But enforcement was spotty. The quacks adapted, changing their titles, using phrases like health advisor, naturalist, or consulting specialist. The game continued. The growing field of pharmacology also sparked reform. As chemistry advanced, so did awareness of toxic ingredients. Analysts tested popular tonics and published their findings. Many contained dangerous levels of alcohol, narcotics, or industrial chemicals. Public health campaigns warned against unregulated cures. Still, demand remained high. Pain didn't wait for policy. Grief didn't pause for science. And fear, especially of the unknown, drove people into the arms of anyone who claimed to have an answer. Not all who sold questionable cures were entirely cynical. Some believed in their methods. Some had witnessed recovery and mistook coincidence for causation. Others were desperate themselves, caught in a cycle of poverty, trying to earn a living with whatever tools they could gather. But many knew exactly what they were doing. They studied salesmanship. They tracked profits. They wrote glowing reviews of their own products under false names. They created illness where there was none, then sold the cure. And in the end, it was the patient, the ordinary man or woman in pain, who paid the price. In the quiet of their homes, they drank the bitter drops, swallowed the pills, and waited. Some felt relief. Some felt worse. A few never rose again. Their stories, mostly lost to time, were part of a larger truth, that the Victorian age, for all its advances, remained a dangerous place to be sick. Especially when those promising help came dressed in charm and empty science. Part 11. The Dangers of Childbirth. In the Victorian home, there was no event more anticipated, and more feared, than the birth of a child. It arrived not with quiet ceremony or safe expectation, but with an undercurrent of dread that every woman understood and few dared to speak aloud. Behind the closed doors of drawing rooms, cottages, and narrow stairwells, women labored with courage, but also with the knowledge that each contraction might bring them closer to death. To give birth in the 19th century was to step across a threshold with no guarantees. It was not a rare fear or an imagined one. The statistics made the truth plain. For every 1,000 births in Victorian Britain, anywhere from 30 to 60 women died. And those who survived often carried injuries that lingered: torn flesh, broken spirits, damaged organs, or the haunting loss of the child they never got to hold. Pregnancy itself was not spoken of in polite society. A lady who found herself expecting again might be described as in a delicate condition, unwell, or simply confined. Newspapers did not print announcements until the child had safely arrived. Public conversations avoided the topic altogether. The sight of a heavily pregnant woman was something to be hidden, a reminder of the body's mysteries, of sex, of mortality. But behind the modest language and drawn curtains, the truth of childbirth was raw and often brutal. Most women gave birth at home. For the working poor, this meant a single room shared by children, relatives, and boarders. For the middle class, it was the marital bedroom, cleaned and prepared as best it could be. The upper class sometimes cleared a chamber for the event, sent for private nurses, and hired a physician. But wealth did not remove risk. Money could offer comfort, but it could not stop infection, bleeding, or error. Midwives attended the majority of births. In rural areas, they were often the only option. Some had years of experience passed down from mothers and aunts. Others had no training at all. A few were remarkable, skilled, compassionate, steady in crisis. But many worked without support, without formal instruction, and without access to tools or medications. They relied on instinct, prayer, and the will of the woman beneath their hands. Doctors, when involved, were usually called only when something went wrong. A labor that stretched too long. A baby that wouldn't turn. A mother who began to hemorrhage. By the time the physician arrived, in a frock coat, with bag in hand, it was often too late. And even when it wasn't, the danger came not just from what they did, but from how they did it. Sterilization was still a novel concept. Doctors moved from patient to patient without washing their hands. They used the same instruments, the same gloves, the same towels. Blood from a previous delivery might still be drying on the edge of the forceps when they knelt beside the next laboring woman. This carelessness, born of ignorance rather than cruelty, led to one of the deadliest conditions of the age, puerperal fever. Also known as childbed fever, it was a bacterial infection of the uterus that struck days after delivery. It began with chills, then fever, then pain. The belly swelled. The skin burned. Within hours, a healthy woman could be dying. There was no cure, no antibiotics. Nothing to do but wait and hope. Most did not survive. It wasn't until the work of Ignaz Semmelweis and later Joseph Lister that germ theory began to explain the invisible culprits. But even after the truth emerged, that dirty hands and contaminated tools were killing mothers, many doctors resisted the implication. To suggest that a gentleman's hands could carry disease was, to them, an insult. Pride and tradition cost lives. Beyond infection, there were countless other dangers. Bleeding could begin suddenly and with terrifying speed. A torn uterus, a retained placenta, a ruptured artery, any of these could pour out life faster than anyone could stop it. Without transfusions or surgical intervention, the woman would grow pale, cold, and silent. Her baby might cry. Or not. Obstructed labor, when the baby could not pass through the birth canal, was another common crisis. In young girls, especially those married early, the pelvis might be too narrow. In women with large babies or twins, the hours dragged on. The midwife's hands could only do so much. If a doctor was summoned, forceps might be used, long metal tongs to pull the baby free. When used properly, they could save lives. When not, they crushed skulls, tore flesh, and left both mother and child in agony. In rare cases, a craniotomy was performed, where the fetus's skull was pierced and collapsed to allow removal. It was a horrifying decision, made only when the child had already died or could not be born otherwise. The mother was left to grieve a child she never saw whole. Pain relief, if it came at all, was inconsistent. Chloroform was introduced in the 1840s and popularized after Queen Victoria accepted it during the birth of her 8th child. Its use, once scandalous, became more acceptable. But many women still labored without it. Some feared the effects. Others were denied by doctors who believed pain was natural, even necessary. There were those who quoted scripture, saying that women were meant to suffer in childbirth as punishment for Eve's sin. The agony, they argued, was divine. What this meant, in practice, was hours, sometimes days, of screaming, sweating, pushing, tearing, bleeding. A woman might grip the sides of a bed frame until her knuckles turned white. She might bite down on cloth to stifle her cries. Neighbors heard. Children hid. Men waited outside, pacing the hallway, powerless. Sometimes, the silence that followed was a blessing. A soft cry. A sigh. Relief. Sometimes, it was the worst sound of all, stillness. If the baby survived but the mother died, the household entered mourning. If both died, it became a tragedy. If the child died first, the mother often followed soon after, in body or in spirit. Some women never recovered from the loss. They walked the halls at night. They stared out windows for hours. They spoke of the baby's name as if it were still sleeping nearby. Complications didn't end with delivery. A retained placenta could lead to sepsis. A torn cervix might never heal. Fistulas, openings between the birth canal and bladder or rectum, left women incontinent, ashamed, isolated. There were no reconstructive surgeries, no support groups. These women were often sent away, hidden, their suffering labeled as misfortune or madness. And yet, for all this, women continued to give birth. Again and again. Sometimes once a year, sometimes more. Contraception was unreliable. Abortion was illegal and dangerous. Marriage brought with it not just companionship, but the expectation of children, as many as could be produced. Each new pregnancy carried new risk. The upper classes had access to better rooms, more attentive nurses, and private physicians. But even there, death hovered. Princess Charlotte of Wales died in childbirth in 1817, along with her son, sending the nation into mourning. Other noblewomen suffered quietly, treated by male doctors who saw them as puzzles, not people. Poor women had fewer illusions. They understood the risks. They leaned on one another, shared what remedies they could, wrapped hot cloths around aching backs and whispered stories of survival. Midwives in these communities, though lacking formal training, often knew more than the doctors who ignored them. By the end of the century, slow progress began to take root. Antiseptic practices spread. Midwifery schools opened. Maternal death rates began to decline, unevenly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Pain relief became more accepted. Hospitals introduced maternity wards. Still, childbirth remained dangerous. Still, women died. What changed most, perhaps, was awareness. Reformers, doctors, and writers began to speak of maternal health as a public concern, not a private sorrow. Statistics were gathered. Reports written, letters sent to Parliament. But for the women themselves, nothing erased the memories. The cold cloths, the trembling knees, the sound of a baby's first breath, or the silence that sometimes followed. Childbirth in the Victorian era was not a gentle passage. It was a trial, a reckoning, a moment suspended between life and death. And yet, in every village and city, in every terrace and tenement, women endured it. Quietly, bravely, over and over again. Part 12. A Breath of Miasma. Before microbes had a name, before microscopes revealed invisible worlds, before the word germ ever passed through the lips of a Victorian physician, there was only smell. It was the first warning, the first clue, the first imagined culprit. The stench of open drains, the rot of spoiled meat, the heavy sweetness of decay. These were the signs of sickness to the people of the 19th century. Disease did not arrive with blood or bruises or fever. It floated on the air. It seeped through windows. It clung to your clothes, your curtains, your breath. They called it miasma, a poisonous vapor, born from filth and foulness, that corrupted the body simply by being inhaled. And for most of the Victorian era, this idea, as flawed as it was, ruled the world of medicine. Miasma theory was not new. Its roots traced back through the centuries, reaching Hippocrates and Galen, echoing through medieval plagues and Renaissance cities. It explained why the poor sickened first, why fevers clustered near swamps and sores, why some neighborhoods seemed cursed while others stayed clean. To the Victorian mind, it made perfect sense. The foulest places produced the deadliest illnesses. The worst smells led to the worst outcomes. Disease was in the very air, and only air could be blamed. In the great cities of the industrial age, that air was thick and terrible. Coal fires painted the sky with soot. Human waste pooled in alleys and cellars. Horse dung piled in the streets. Factories pumped out steam laced with chemicals. And in the poorest neighborhoods, where a dozen people shared a single room, the atmosphere became a stew of human heat, damp linen, and breath gone sour with hunger. Doctors entered these rooms and recoiled. They felt nausea before they took a pulse. They gagged at the smell of decay before they asked about symptoms. To them, illness had a scent, and that scent was death. It was not just a theory. It was conviction. Hospitals were built with high ceilings and wide windows, not for aesthetics but for ventilation. Wards were designed to allow breezes to pass through. Sanatoriums were located on hilltops and sea cliffs, places where the air was believed to be fresh, cleansing, untainted by the miasmas below. At night, people sealed their windows against the fog, fearful it might carry invisible poisons into their lungs. On warm days, they tied handkerchiefs around their faces. In courtrooms, it was not uncommon to see witnesses and jurors holding oranges spiked with cloves under their noses, a barrier, they believed, against the contagion of smell. Doctors carried pomanders, small orbs of fragrant herbs, to shield themselves. Nurses soaked their aprons in vinegar. Incense burned in church aisles. Tobacco smoke was believed to be protective. Vinegar was splashed on walls and floors. And in homes, mothers scattered dried lavender, camphor, or even burning tar to drive the sickness away. The belief in miasma shaped every aspect of life and death. When cholera struck in the 1830s, the fear of airborne infection gripped London like a vice. Thousands died in weeks. The poor died first, packed into tenements, drinking from shared pumps, living over open cesspools. The smell of their neighborhoods was unbearable. And so the cause, everyone agreed, must lie in the air. The government responded by cleaning streets. They ordered the removal of trash, the whitewashing of walls, the burning of sulfur. It made no difference. The deaths continued. But the smell was all they could see. Few dared suggest otherwise. One who did was Dr. John Snow, a quiet man with a sharp mind and little taste for glory. During the cholera outbreak of 1854, he mapped the deaths around Broad Street in Soho, not by smell, but by water. He discovered that nearly all the victims had drawn their drinking water from the same public pump. He argued that cholera was not airborne but waterborne. He had the pump handle removed. Cases dropped. The evidence was there, clear, simple, logical. But the idea was too new, too strange. The air, after all, still smelled foul. The sores still ran beneath their feet. And so, even as Snow's theory gained supporters, the public, and much of the medical establishment, clung to the comfort of miasma. In 1858, London suffered the Great Stink, a heat wave so intense it baked the sewage-soaked Thames into a stinking ribbon of filth. The stench invaded Parliament itself, where curtains soaked in lime chloride failed to protect the noses of legislators. Faced with the undeniable evidence, or rather, the undeniable smell, the government acted. Not to remove the cholera. Not to purify the water. But to clear the air. This led to the creation of London's vast sewer system, designed by engineer Joseph Basil Gett. Ironically, while the plan was based on flawed assumptions about miasma, it succeeded in removing the real source of disease, contaminated water. Mortality rates fell. Cholera faded. And yet, miasma theory continued to dominate medical thinking for decades. Public health efforts, too, were shaped by this mistaken belief. Tenement inspections focused on smell. Regulations targeted air quality. Hospitals were relocated away from industrial zones, not to avoid pollutants, but to escape supposed miasmas. Even the architecture of new housing reflected these ideas. Ventilation shafts were added to rooms. Windows were made larger. Urban planning favored wide boulevards and green belts, not for beauty or space, but to let the deadly vapors drift away. Doctors published treatises on the danger of foul air. Some claimed that specific odors, like those from fish markets or tanneries, caused particular diseases. Others warned that night air, heavy and cold, was more dangerous than the breeze of day. The poor, already blamed for their poverty, were now blamed for their smells. Filth became moral failure. Illness became proof of vice. If your neighborhood stank, it was your fault. If you died of fever, you had brought it on yourself. And so the burden of public health fell on those least able to bear it. Women were told to scrub their homes with lime. Families were ordered to move out during fumigations. Tenants were evicted for dangerous conditions. Little was done to fix the root causes: inadequate plumbing, contaminated water, overcrowding. The air was all that mattered. Meanwhile, real advances in microbiology unfolded slowly, in laboratories and lecture halls. Louis Pasteur demonstrated the presence of microorganisms in spoiled liquids. Robert Koch identified the bacteria responsible for tuberculosis and cholera. The lens of science shifted from the air to the microscope. But ideas, especially old ones, die slowly. Many doctors resisted germ theory. It contradicted everything they had been taught. It made them responsible for spreading disease. It demanded new habits, new humility. Some adopted antiseptic techniques grudgingly. Others mocked the new thinking. One physician, upon hearing Joseph Lister's instructions on hand washing and sterilization, reportedly declared, "Nonsense, a little dirt is good for the soul." And so, the world moved forward in pieces. In some hospitals, instruments were boiled. In others, they were wiped on aprons. Some midwives washed their hands between births. Others didn't. The miasma theory didn't vanish in a single moment. It dissolved slowly, like fog at dawn. Its influence lingered in policy, in superstition, in fear. Even today, the echoes remain, in the instinct to hold one's breath in a foul-smelling alley, to spray perfume after illness, to equate odor with risk. But for the people of the Victorian age, miasma was more than a mistake. It was a mirror. It reflected their fear of poverty, of disease, of death. It allowed them to see illness as something external, a vapor, a cloud, rather than something passed from their own hands. And in doing so, it delayed the truths that could have saved lives. Part 13. The Surgeon's Apron. In the cold, echoing chambers of the Victorian operating theatre, the surgeon stood at the centre, not only as a healer, but as a performer, a figure of science, and sometimes a symbol of dread. He wore no white coat, no mask, no gloves. He wore an apron. And the apron was not clean. It was stained with blood, dark, dry, sometimes crusted in layers from dozens of operations. To the modern eye, it would have seemed grotesque. To the Victorian surgeon, it was a badge of honor. In a world still fumbling toward modern medicine, the figure in the blood-soaked apron was not an abomination. He was experience made flesh, proof of how many operations he had performed, how many lives he had touched, how many bodies had laid still beneath his blade. To remove the stains would have been to erase the record of his labor. Surgical science in the 19th century stood on the trembling bridge between brutality and brilliance. The scalpel had become sharper. Techniques had improved. But compassion had yet to arrive in full. The apron told the story, not of the patient's comfort, but of the surgeon's certainty. Operating rooms, when they existed, were often cramped and exposed. In the larger hospitals of London, Edinburgh, and Manchester, theatres were built to hold students and observers. Wooden benches rose in tiers. Gas lamps flickered overhead. Dust settled on shoulders and hair. In the center, under the lights, stood the patient, pale, frightened, and still conscious in many cases. Surgeries had to be fast. Pain relief, if used at all, was unreliable. Chloroform and ether were gaining ground, but dosing was imprecise. Surgeons prided themselves on speed. To remove a limb in under 3 minutes was the mark of a skilled man. The longer it took, the more the patient suffered, and the more dangerous the outcome. And so they worked quickly. Saws moved with terrifying rhythm. Knives opened skin in long, practiced strokes. Arteries were clamped, vessels tied off with silk. Assistants wiped sweat from the surgeon's brow. Blood spattered shoes. Hands trembled. In the worst cases, patients died on the table, not from the operation itself, but from the shock. What happened afterward was often worse. Infection was common. The tools were not cleaned between patients. A sponge used to soak blood from one man's chest might be pressed into another's wound a few minutes later. The surgeon wiped his hands on his apron and moved on. Germ theory was still young, and among surgeons, deeply controversial. Many rejected the idea that invisible creatures caused infection. They blamed bad air, poor constitution, or the patient's own moral failings. To suggest that a surgeon might bring death with his own hands, that the blood beneath his fingernails could kill, was unthinkable to many. And so the apron stayed on. The garments of surgery were not white but dark, browns, blacks, deep greens, designed to hide the blood. They were never laundered. Some surgeons believed repeated exposure to blood made their bodies immune to disease. Others simply saw no reason to change. Instruments were carried in wooden boxes, lined with velvet or silk. Knives, saws, forceps, clamps, each with brass fittings, polished handles, and sharp, unforgiving edges. They were beautiful, in their way. Crafted by hand, passed from teacher to student, they were the tools of the trade, as much a part of the surgeon's identity as the apron he wore. There was pride in this profession. Surgeons were not always considered equals to physicians, at least not at first. In earlier centuries, they had been lumped in with barbers and bone setters. But by the 19th century, that was changing. Surgery was becoming a science. Universities began offering formal training. The Royal College of Surgeons held examinations and published journals. And still, the culture of blood remained. To study surgery was to study the body without sentiment. Cadavers were dissected in chilly lecture halls. Muscles were sketched. Bones labeled. Nerves traced. Students watched as organs were removed, weighed, examined. The body became a machine to be learned, not a person to be mourned. By the time a surgeon reached the operating room, he had seen hundreds of corpses. His hands were sure. His voice, calm. He did not hesitate, not because he lacked empathy, but because hesitation could kill. And so the apron absorbed each lesson. Stains marked the failures and successes. A long smear from a ruptured spleen. A patch of dried blood from an amputation that went well. A tear in the cloth from where a patient kicked in fear. Each mark was history. The patients, of course, saw something different. They saw the apron first, before the face, before the voice, before the hand on their shoulder. And what they saw was not reassurance. They saw the blood of others. They imagined their own. Some were too frightened to run. Others were too weak. They lay on the table and stared at the ceiling. Sometimes they cried out. Sometimes they bit down on wood. Sometimes they were already beyond fear. The surgeon adjusted his tools. He rolled up his sleeves. And the apron, always the apron, remained. Joseph Lister changed all that, or tried to. A quiet man with sharp observation and patient discipline, Lister had read Pasteur's research. He believed in microbes. He saw the connection between unwashed hands and infected wounds. He introduced carbolic acid into the surgical suite, to clean instruments, to sterilize the area, to prevent infection. He washed his hands. He wore clean clothes. He urged others to do the same. The pushback was intense. Colleagues mocked him. Some refused to follow his protocols. Carbolic spray was uncomfortable. It irritated the skin, stung the eyes, left a chemical smell. More importantly, it implied guilt. To change the practice was to admit that what had come before was wrong. But the results spoke. Mortality rates dropped. Patients survived amputations that once meant certain death. Wounds healed. Septicemia declined. And slowly, very slowly, the apron began to fade from the surgeon's body. By the 1880s, antiseptic technique was gaining ground. Rubber gloves were introduced. Gowns became standard. Aprons were still worn, but they were clean. Instruments were boiled, not wiped. The air was filtered. The operating room, once a place of spectacle and speed, became quieter, calmer, more precise. But the legacy of the old apron lingered. In some hospitals, surgeons clung to their stained garments. They wore them as signs of seniority. A freshly trained doctor, washed and white-coated, was seen as soft. Real men wore blood. And so the two worlds overlapped, the old and the new. On one table, a man bled onto a surgeon in a red-speckled coat. On another, a woman was stitched by gloved hands beneath sterilized lights. The shift had begun, but it would take decades to complete. The surgeon's apron, once a mark of pride, had become a reminder of how far they had come, of how many had died, of how the body, once treated like a machine, was finally being seen as human. Today, we see surgeons in blue gowns, in clean gloves, in stainless rooms with humming monitors and sterile trays. But somewhere in that lineage, hidden in the folds of time, lies that old blood-soaked cloth. Not as a relic of glory, but as a warning of what medicine once was, and what it must never be again. Part 14. Smells like death. The Victorian hospital had many horrors, but the one that arrived first, before the sight of the blood-stained sheets, before the sound of moaning, was the smell. It drifted through the corridors like a warning, settled into the walls like smoke, and clung to the skin of anyone who walked through its doors. You did not need to see the wound. You could smell it. You did not need to touch the fevered skin. The sourness in the air told you everything. You did not need to be a doctor. Only human. There was no escaping it. It lived in the folds of uniforms, in the grain of the floorboards, in the hair of nurses, in the coats of surgeons. Every corner held its own note, some sharper, some heavier, some nauseating in their familiarity. Hospitals in Victorian Britain were not places of sanitized precision. They were buildings of breath, blood, and decay. Cleanliness was aspirational, not expected. Laundry facilities were limited. Ventilation was poor. And so the air itself became thick with history, the unwashed remnants of suffering. Step into a surgical ward, and the smell hit like a punch. Old blood, dark, iron-rich, half-dried, crusted onto aprons, tables, tools. Carbolic acid stung the nose. Its sharpness meant to mask what lay beneath. Pus, thick and sweet-rotting, oozed from wounds wrapped too late or too loosely. Gangrene was unmistakable, a sickly mix of rotten meat gone too long in the sun. Patients lay in rows, their breath mingling with the odors of infection. Feces and urine soaked into straw mattresses. Vomit pooled in buckets. Dressings were changed too rarely, and often only when soaked through. Sometimes a breeze came through a cracked window. Sometimes it didn't. Most of the time, the air simply hung, heavy and still. The maternity wards had their own perfume, blood and milk and sweat and fear. Women labored for hours in overheated rooms, their bodies slick with effort. Sheets were not changed between deliveries. Hands were not always washed. The scent of childbirth was metallic and earthy, alive and terrible. When it ended well, there was relief. When it didn't, the room held something colder, the quiet, unmistakable smell of death. And then there were the asylums. In the locked wards of the mad and forgotten, the air took on a different weight. The unbathed bodies of dozens crowded into tight halls. Waste in corners. Mold in stone cracks. Food left to sour. the sick sweet odor of despair. Some patients rocked in silence. Others screamed. But the smell was always there, filling the space left by reason. To the Victorian doctor, smell was more than nuisance, it was diagnosis. Miasma theory, which dominated much of the century, taught that odor itself caused disease. If something stank, it was dangerous. If it smelled clean, it was safe. This logic shaped everything. Hospitals were judged not by survival rates, but by their scent. A ward that reeked was considered a threat, not because of germs, but because of bad air. Homes were inspected by public health officials who sniffed their way from room to room. Privies were lime-washed. Streets were tarred, not to prevent disease, but to smother the stench. And yet the smells returned. Always. Even the chemist's shop, meant to be a place of healing, carried its own cloud: camphor, licorice, alcohol, laudanum, menthol, and vinegar. Bottles lined the shelves, each with its own pungency. A child's fever brought out mustard plasters. A man's nerve trouble called for opium. Both smelled like solutions, until they failed. In the home, people fought scent with scent. Housewives burned herbs or hung bunches of lavender in the corners. Vinegar-soaked cloths were draped over bedposts. Oranges spiked with cloves were placed in drawers. In wealthier homes, servants aired out rooms daily, scrubbing floors with pine oil or bleaching linens in the sun. But these efforts only reached so far. The deeper scents, the ones that came from inside the body, could not be scrubbed away. Tuberculosis had a smell. So did typhoid. Cancer, especially in its later stages, brought an unmistakable foulness, something deep and sour, metallic and earthy. Doctors wrote of it in journals. Nurses whispered of it between shifts. They didn't need thermometers. They had noses. The dead had their own language, written in odor. A newly passed body gave off a stillness, yes, but soon, the smell of muscle decay, blood pooling, and bacterial bloom began. Hospitals without morgues had to move quickly. Bodies were wheeled into side rooms, covered with cloths already steeped in other histories. If relatives did not come soon, the smell told the staff when it was time. Even the living feared it. Patients in their final hours often turned their faces to the wall. Not from pain, from shame. They knew what was coming. They could smell it already. Some wept. Others apologized. A few simply closed their eyes and waited. Outside the hospital, in the streets of London or Liverpool, the air carried its own warnings. The stench of overflowing cesspools. The reek of animal markets. The brine-sour smell of fishmongers on a hot day. In poorer districts, the sour-sweet tang of human waste running through gutters. In alleys, the rot of cabbage water and meat bones tossed from tenement windows. The smoke of coal fires clinging to everything. Doctors walked these streets and read them like charts. They could tell which houses had illness just by the wind. They spoke of bad corners, of sick blocks, of dangerous flats. What they really meant was, you could smell the disease before you saw it. But not all smells were condemned. Some became associated with medicine itself. Carbolic acid, used by Joseph Lister to sterilize instruments and wounds, became the scent of progress. It stung the eyes, burned the throat, lingered on hands for days, but it lowered death rates. Hospitals that smelled of carbolic were seen as modern. It became the perfume of reform. Eucalyptus oil was used for breathing. Menthol rubbed on chests. Camphor on pillows. These were the medicinal scents of hope, sharp, strange, but comforting. Others were darker. Chloroform carried a sweetness that turned sickly after long exposure. Nurses could tell when too much had been used. The smell crept up from the mouth of an unconscious patient, warning of trouble. Ether was more volatile, more bitter. Both were inescapable in surgical rooms. Doctors and nurses wore these scents on their bodies. A surgeon might carry the smell of blood, carbolic, and skin for hours after a procedure. A midwife bore the scent of sweat, linen, and afterbirth. A nurse returned home with the perfume of her patient's pain stitched into her uniform. They tried to wash it away. Many couldn't. Some found themselves avoiding food. The smell of meat reminded them of amputations. Boiled eggs, of tumors. Burned fat, of cauterized wounds. They changed clothes before entering their own homes. They opened windows even in winter. Still, the odors followed. There were those who said you could tell a hospital worker from across a room, not by their clothes, not by their manner, but by the scent that clung to them. And it wasn't entirely metaphor. Smell shaped memory. A child who watched her mother die of fever might flinch for years at the smell of vinegar and boiled flannel. A man who had his leg amputated remembered not just the pain, but the stink of blood, the staleness of the operating room. Patients who recovered spoke of the smell of themselves, how their own bodies had betrayed them, turned foul. Even religion could not mask it. In hospital chapels, incense was burned not just for prayer, but to cleanse the air. Candles flickered beside the sick. Holy water was sprinkled not only for sanctity, but to sweeten the stench of decay. Priests and pastors leaned close, their eyes watering. And through it all, the belief in miasma, that smell was the sickness itself, endured. It wasn't just a symptom. It was the cause. To breathe it was to be doomed. That idea, wrong as it was, still carried a kind of truth. Because in those rooms, in those wards, in those narrow tenement stairwells, what people were breathing was deadly. The stench was a warning, not of air, but of bacteria. Not of sin, but of suffering. And it lingered. Long after the beds were changed. Long after the walls were repainted. Long after the names were forgotten. The smells remained in memory. In fabric. In fear. Smells like death. Not imagined, not metaphor. Just history, hanging in the air. Part 15. The Final Breath. The world of Victorian medicine was not defined by triumph. It was not a place of clean recoveries, quiet machines, or swift relief. It was a place of trying, a long, desperate, and often painful trying. And still, they tried. In hospital wards, in home kitchens, in crumbling asylums and polished drawing rooms, the sick and those who tended to them fought for every breath. They did so without the knowledge we now take for granted. They did so without safety nets. And many did not make it. But some did. And every life saved, even by chance, helped carry the story of medicine forward. As the century turned, so too did the tools. The stethoscope, once a novelty, became standard. Thermometers brought precision. Microscopes unveiled an invisible world of bacteria. Hospitals began to separate the clean from the contaminated. White coats replaced black. Rubber gloves found their way into operating rooms. And, slowly, the blood-soaked aprons were folded and left behind. But progress was uneven. In one neighborhood, a child might receive ether for a broken bone. Just a few streets away, another would be treated with a herbal poultice and a whispered prayer. In the city, antiseptic wards began saving lives. In the countryside, doctors still traveled muddy roads with leeches in their bags and laudanum in their coats. The Victorian age did not end its suffering all at once. It softened it, inch by inch, wound by wound. And yet, its legacy endured. The lessons learned, often through pain, formed the foundation of modern medicine. Mistakes became case studies. Failures became caution. And behind every breakthrough stood those who had endured the years before the cure. There is a certain courage in ignorance, not foolishness, but resilience. The kind of bravery it takes to walk into a hospital knowing that pain awaits. To carry a child to a clinic and pray she survives the fever. To stitch a wound in dim light and hope, with nothing more than instinct and herbs. That courage defined the patients of the Victorian era. They laid themselves bare, on wooden tables, in narrow beds, beneath scalpels and syringes and fingers crossed. They trusted those who didn't always deserve it. They endured when they could, and mourned when they couldn't. And the healers? They, too, lived between doubt and duty. Some were quacks and charlatans. Others were scholars and saints. Many were both, mistaken and sincere, clumsy and devoted. They believed in theories we now know to be false. But they believed fiercely, and with that belief came effort. Because even when their tools were wrong, their intentions, more often than not, were not. There was love in those dirty hands. In the way a nurse cooled a brow with vinegar water. In the way a surgeon muttered reassurance before the sore came down. In the way a mother dabbed mustard on her daughter's chest, hoping the warmth would ease the cough. That love was medicine too. We can look back now with distance, with the clarity of knowledge, the comfort of antibiotics, the power of precision. We can see the madness of bleeding a man to treat his heart. We can recoil at the idea of children being fed opium. We can shake our heads at bloodletting, blistering, and trepanning. But we must also honor the intention. Because from that chaos came order. From that guessing came science. From those fumbling, blood-soaked hands came the sterile tools we use today. It is easy to forget how recent much of our certainty is. How young our understanding of infection. How recent the concept of anesthesia. How freshly born the germ theory of disease. Victorian medicine was the storm before the calm. And like any storm, it was loud, and messy, and full of danger. But storms clear the air. They make room for light. In the end, what the Victorian era gave us, more than technique, more than theory, was the humility to admit how little we once knew, and the courage to move forward anyway. It gave us questions. It gave us warning signs. And it gave us stories. Stories of women who labored in the dark, and lived. Of men who limped home after amputations and rebuilt their lives. Of children who clutched dolls in fever dreams and opened their eyes days later to sunlight. Of nurses who wiped brows, mopped floors, and held hands as breath slowed and stopped. It gave us the surgeon who changed his apron for a clean one. It gave us the doctor who looked into a microscope and saw something terrifying and true. It gave us the mother who, with no science at all, stayed awake night after night, watching, waiting, whispering songs into the dark because she knew, more than any book could teach, that healing began with presence. Those quiet acts echo still. You can see them in the steady hand of a modern nurse inserting an for, in the gentle pressure of a stethoscope on a child's chest, in the clipped footsteps of a doctor crossing a sterile hallway to deliver difficult news. And you can smell the difference. Not the rot, the pus, the burning, but alcohol, latex, maybe antiseptic soap. Smells that still warn, but no longer wound. Today, the breath of the patient is no longer a death sentence. It is measured, watched, supported. We have machines that breathe for the dying. We have medicine that cools fevers. We have knowledge hard-won from the mistakes of centuries. But with all that progress, with all the silence where once screams echoed, we must not forget the sound of the final breath in the age that came before. It was not always peaceful. It was not always painless. But it was human. And in every heaving chest, every rasping throat, every last exhale beneath the gaslights of a Victorian hospital, there was one final gift left behind, the unspoken plea that those who came next would do better. And we did. Because they endured.